Happy Halloween and welcome to Monday Night Live, the virtually glitch-free, soon-to-be viral YouTube show from the staff at Inside ND Sports and the Rivals Network. I'm Eric Hansen. He's Tyler James. Our recruiting writer, Kyle Kelly, is still out trick-or-treating, we assume, dressed up as Drew Pine. Tonight, Tyler and I will break down Notre Dame's 41-24 spanking of Syracuse and spin it forward into the context of the season. We'll also take your questions, and that segment is coming up soon. So start filling up the question portal.
Yes, and also make sure you hit the thumbs up to give us a like on this video and also subscribe. That helps us get in front of a lot more viewers, so we would appreciate if you took the time to do that. And before we get to your questions, we're going to have Eric run through his 5 most important headlines from Marcus Freeman's press conference earlier Monday. Eric, what was your first headline from what Marcus Freeman told us today?
Well, it wasn't a super newsy press conference today. There were a lot of interesting tidbits, but not a lot of headlines. So some of these are kind of reading between the lines. But my number one headline is both quarterbacks are struggling into this game, coming into this game.
Mm-hmm.
Drew Pine continues to plummet in the national pass efficiency ratings. He's down to 52nd. He was 9 of 19. For 116 yards, a touchdown, and an interception. If you're wondering when the last time Notre Dame had fewer than 9 completions in a game, it was 10 years ago when Tommy Rees filled in for Everett Golson against BYU, and the Irish had 8 in that game. Tommy had 7, and Andrew Hendricks had 1. And as far as Clemson, DJ Uiagalelei got benched after the third quarter with Clemson trailing 21-10 to the Syracuse team Notre Dame just beat. Clemson was playing at home. They got 17 points in the fourth quarter with their 5-star freshman Cade Klubnik running the show. Now, he didn't have spectacular stats, but he didn't have turnovers, which was what was happening with DJ. And he's 45th in the country in pass efficiency, so he's kind of in Drew Pine's neighborhood. Last year he was 107th, so at least he's improved since last year.
I couldn't help but chuckle. Clemson now has 2 quarterbacks, and I'm not sure if we all know how to say their last names, because I've heard Klubnik and Klubnik, and then most people like yourself just opt for DJ, then trying to attempt Uiagalelei. So both of those guys are certainly talented. Uiagalelei's struggles have been a bit perplexing, I think, from the Clemson perspective. There's certainly talent within him, and you would like to think
he was the number 1 player in the country in 2020.
Right, and you would like to think if any place he's going to be comfortable, it would be at Notre Dame Stadium, right? I mean, that was his coming out party. So I would be a bit surprised if he wasn't the starter. I think Dabo Swinney's been pretty adamant that will be the case, but even if it wasn't going to be, you could see him maybe playing some games with Notre Dame. But I think Notre Dame will be prepared for what each brings. I don't know that Cade Klubnik had a big role in why Clemson was able to come back and beat Syracuse. A lot of that was done on the ground, but I do think there was just they needed something to pick the team up and give a little bit of a change of pace, and that certainly helped Clemson against Syracuse. So neither of the team's starting quarterbacks played well against Syracuse, and both of the teams were able to win despite that. So I think that certainly sums up where Notre Dame is at as a football team right now, the quarterback questions. And I'm not exactly sure what to think about what Clemson's quarterbacks can and will be this Saturday.
Well, I mean, the one thing in the games that I've seen of DJ play, I saw him play in the Wake Forest double overtime win that they had against the Demon Deacons. He was moving a lot better. He lost some weight, and he's a better runner. And in that game, he actually played well with his passing game. We should point out Clemson had a bye last week, so nobody played quarterback last week. And going back to the 2020 game, DJ was filling in for Trevor Lawrence, who had COVID and was just getting over his bout of COVID. He actually traveled to Notre Dame Stadium and was wearing a mask. but he threw for an opponent record 439 yards against the Irish in the Notre Dame double overtime victory.
Yeah, I wonder how many people have like Notre Dame Stadium records and then got to play at Notre Dame Stadium another time, because I wouldn't imagine the first time you play Notre Dame Stadium, if you're going to play there multiple times, would be that when that would happen. So that's definitely a rare opportunity for DJ Uiagalelei. All right, Eric, what is your second headline from Marcus Freeman's press conference on Monday?
Well, the second headline is the Dabo and Marcus Freeman parallels. And I'm not saying that it's going to have the same middle chapters or ending, but they both started out kind of similar. Somebody kind of asked Marcus about that, and he doesn't know Dabo very well, but he's followed his career. And he said, boy, if it turned out like that, it would be great. Now, Dabo's had a double-digit win seasons every year since 2011. But he was the coach. He became the coach in 2008 on an interim basis, and they went 4-3. And then the next year, his first full year, they went 9-4, which Notre Dame has a shot at. And then they went 6-7 before really things took over. Now, Dabo not only had no head coaching experience, he didn't even have coordinator experience. And so there was some controversy in terms of the fan base. Now, the people that followed recruiting loved the hire, loved him being elevated to the interim coach, and loved the permanent move. The people that didn't follow recruiting saying, what are we doing hiring a guy that's never called a play on either side of the ball? What kind of put him over the edge, I was talking to Tim Beret today. Tim is a longtime former Clemson SID, and he's also has a Notre Dame background as well. But he said they won the South Carolina rivalry game, the last regular season game when he was the interim. And Steve Spurrier was the coach. So you have a Hall of Fame coach winning a rivalry, gets carried off the field. He said, if Dabo doesn't win that game, Clemson's history changes forever, because he didn't think he'd get the job. But again, a guy that didn't have head coaching experience, was an excellent recruiter, struggled early, and then the recruiting thing paid off, and he grew into really good head coach. We can't predict that'll happen for Marcus, but that's what Jack Swarbrick, the athletic director at Notre Dame, kind of is betting on in his decision to hire him to follow Brian Kelly.
Yeah, I don't think Marcus Freeman was exactly going out on a limb by saying I'd love to have Dabo Swinney's career. I mean, anyone would be happy to have 2 national championships to their name. So obviously a long way to go there for Marcus Freeman, and the start hasn't been ideal, but you see signs of Notre Dame picking up on things that he wants to see within the program, and they're certainly rising to the occasion in bigger moments. But seemingly not rising to the occasion in the smaller moments that you would sort of maybe take for granted. And Notre Dame has learned that they can't take those moments for granted this season. So you'd like to think that would lead to Notre Dame being able to play some version of its best football against Clemson this Saturday, because they have lived up to the moment, even if they haven't won. Like at Ohio State, it was still a competitive game and something that Notre Dame could be proud of. And we'll see if they can do that this week. But yeah, the coaching matchup is interesting. It's you sort of get reminded of how young Marcus Freeman is as a coach when he's like, yeah, I've never actually talked to Dabo Swinney before, which makes sense, because it's not like they've run in a lot of the same circles. I think sometimes head coaches talk to a lot of different head coaches, but he's never been a head coach before, and hasn't coached against him very often, and just hasn't crossed paths with him because his coaching career is much shorter. So it's not that weird that they haven't crossed paths, but you sort of get reminded of that when something like that comes up.
Yeah, and I should mention Dabo was 38 when he got the job, and Marcus was 35 when he was named Notre Dame's head coach. So there are some parallels there. But yeah, it's interesting. I think my point is, don't write the guy off. Let's get through one season and see what that looks like at the end of the season. But yeah, the Stanford Marshall losses. These are games that Brian Kelly was in games like that, but usually didn't lose them. He had a couple of them early. Tulsa in 2010, his first season, South Florida to open the 2011 season. But he got to the point where he could survive those games instead of, them kind of, puncturing a big hole in the season.
All right, Eric, before I ask for your third headline, I'm going to ask our viewers to submit some questions that we can get to after we're done wrapping up your headlines. We'd like to hear what you'd like us to talk about before we get to some other things. So please send us some questions. If you don't know how to do that, if you're on a desktop, you can use the chat feature that's to the right of the video that you're watching. Make sure that you are on the YouTube site and not watching us embedded on either Inside ND Sports or the Insider Lounge, and that will allow you to get access to the chat function. And if you're on a mobile device, the chat box should be below the video where you're seeing us talking. So please send us some questions. We want to hear from you. And before we do that, let's hear from Eric. What is your third headline from Monday's Marcus Freeman press conference, Eric?
Well, number 3 is it's all about practice part 1. And we're using the example of Jordan Botelho. Now, Jordan hadn't played a defensive snap since the North Carolina game at the end of September. And he had been a really good special teams player. All of a sudden, he pops up in the game, gets 2 sacks and a quarterback hurry, plays only 13 snaps, but pretty impactful snaps. So it kind of goes to show you that you're not necessarily buried for good on the depth chart. And Marcus Freeman was talking today about, it's because he had a really good week of practice, and he kind of earned – he earned those snaps. He earned that playing time. He earned that opportunity. And that if he wants to play again this week, he's going to have to earn it all over again. And I know that a lot of people have written to me either in chat or emails and saying, hey, what about Joe Montana? He wasn't a great practice player. He was a gamer. And Marcus Freeman says no such thing as gamers. They want people to prove it in practice, and that's how they'll get their playing time.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Joe Montana was more or less forced into the lineup too, right? It
was an injury, yes.
Right. That's how you can sort of prove yourself to be a gamer when you're sort of forced to play. But Notre Dame isn't in a position to play someone like a Jordan Botelho that they feel like they have to play him. They have enough depth on the defensive line that they feel like they can get away with not playing him. I think the movement of Justin Adamalola to playing more of the field end position rather than the Viper end gave an opening for someone to play some more Viper reps. They tried Junior Tuihalamaka before Jordan Botelho, if I remember correctly. At least I believe he was out on the field first before Jordan Botelho, and I don't know that anything significant happened in those reps. Jordan Botelho took advantage of his reps, particularly in the second half. I believe both of his sacks came in the second half, and maybe he's in a more it's an easier position to play when you're pretty much expecting Syracuse to pass, and it's a little maybe the offense is a little more predictable when they're trying to come back from a deficit. But if they can count on him, I think there's reasons to believe that, or there's reasons to be excited about his potential. It's just never been, Notre Dame seemingly hasn't been able to figure out how to use him in a way that can consistently get out of him what it needs. And I think there's always a worry that maybe he won't be fundamentally sound, be in the right place. And sometimes he plays a little hot. I think if you watch him playing special teams, he likes to jaw, he likes to get in people's face. And you can't obviously risk that in terms of giving someone a free first down when you're on defense. So that's something that I think Notre Dame has to be careful with. But if Jordan Botelho can prove to be disciplined and do what he's asked, there seems to be talent within him, and at a position that Notre Dame could use some help if it maneuvers guys around, like giving Justin Adamalola some different rushing opportunities besides just behind Isaiah Foskey.
Well, that position is going to be wide open next year because Isaiah Foskey and Justin Adamalola are going to be gone. And so you'll have him fighting for it with, probably Josh Burnham and maybe a freshman like Boubacar Traore. But it's wide open for whoever looks good this offseason.
Yeah, and I wonder if Junior Tuihalamaka is someone that they're interested in that long term, considering that they threw him out there. I mean, that was the biggest surprise of the game, just that he lined up there. I was like, wait a minute, I was like, wait, are they playing a 3-man front? I was like, no, he's playing defensive end for them right now. So that was what they wanted to do, and like I said, I don't know that was something that made a difference in the game, but Jordan Metella certainly took advantage of his opportunity. All right, Eric, what is your fourth headline from today's press conference?
Well, it's all about practice part 2, and that applies to Audric Estime. And it was interesting Saturday to see Notre Dame come out in an I formation. Now, early in my career, that's about all I saw teams play. So you don't see that very often these days. He was lined up as the fullback. He got the first 2 carries of the game after having lost fumbles in 3 out of the last 4 games and getting benched in the UNLV game. He ended up with a career high 20 carries, and that was good for 123 yards and 2 touchdowns. And, Marcus Freeman said we never lost faith in Audric, and yet he had to earn the trust back in practice. So they did all kinds of supposedly new ball security drills and so forth, and he proved himself in practice. So, they were not hesitant to put him out there and give him the first 2 carries of the game and give him as many carries as anybody else. Logan Diggs also had 20 carries. And I haven't mentioned him enough in both my column and my analysis on Monday. Diggs had fewer yards. He had 85 yards on 20 carries. But man, there was a lot of yards after contact with him.
Right.
I mean, just this pile moving, it looked pretty interesting.
Yeah, and it was noticeable in the JMA Dome that you could hear the crowd start to get excited when Notre Dame running backs would get hit at first, and then they'd get 5 or 6 more yards after that initial hit. I in watching the game back on TV, you can't really hear it as much on TV, but in person there, especially, it's an open air press box. You're indoors. It's very loud in there. You could hear sort of the excitement and then the sort of deflation of, oh man, they got the first down still. Logan Diggs and Audric Estime were both culprits for doing that for Notre Dame. So those guys were running hard. I smiled a little bit seeing 2 back sets to start the game, because that is something I've been sort of hammering that Notre Dame needs to do more, and did
2 backs and 2 tight ends.
Did very little against Stanford and UNLV. And I asked Tommy Reese about that last week when we had a chance to talk to him, and he said it's sort of matchup based when they want to use that, what they believe, how the defense will react to 2 back sets. Now, certainly I didn't necessarily have in mind sort of this I formation that they used to start the game. I was thinking more of something that they tried a little bit later when they run someone like Chris Tyree in motion, or do some different things with those guys lined up out of a shotgun formation. But the I formation works as well. I think the next wrinkle is them passing out of it potentially, and we'll see how much Notre Dame wants to use 2 back sets against Clemson this weekend. And I think Notre Dame is probably going to need to do some tendency breaking against a defense like Clemson that is good. And if they know what you're going to do, that's only going to make your job that much harder. So I really like what Notre Dame is doing with this backfield, how those guys are playing. I still think there's potential within Chris Tyree that he's not quite reaching. He just hasn't been able to break the big plays. I think I looked this up yesterday or Sunday, or Sunday was yesterday. So it tells you how the start of my week is going. He only has, I believe, 4 rushes of more than 10 yards this season, and Audric Estime is in the double digits with that. I think Audric's had one in every game since the season opener. I don't think he had one against Ohio State, but since then he has at least a 10-yard or 11-yard gain in every game so far. So the other running backs are being more explosive. That isn't what you would necessarily think. Now, Chris Tyree is probably more likely to be a guy that would maybe turn a 10-yard gain into an 80-yard gain than maybe Audric Estime would be, or even Logan Diggs. But I think that Notre Dame is going to have to use those guys a lot in combination this week, and continue to sort of take the pressure off of Drew Pine. Now, whether they will have success against a defense like Clemson's remains to be seen.
What's interesting about defenses, because I run the numbers every Sunday of, all kinds of offensive and defensive categories and special teams. Clemson right now is 27th in the country in total defense. Notre Dame, what do you think they are?
33rd.
28th.
28th. So that wasn't that far off.
they've been surging the last few weeks. Now, I would say Syracuse is the only good offense of those three,
right?
But still, nevertheless, that's an interesting improvement.
Yeah, Notre Dame's flaw has been they sort of give up the big plays, and it makes it feel sometimes bigger, or it makes it sort of overshadows all the 3-and-outs that they've been getting the last few games, and that has certainly been an important part of the defensive success in the last 3 games. So that is part of why we've seen the increase in the total defense ranking there.
And before we get to the next headline, I want to remind you we're getting close to the question segment, so fill up the queue. It's starting to trickle in. You can make fun of us for mispronouncing your name, but fill up that question queue.
Yeah, you can make fun of us, but you have to tell us how we're supposed to say it if we did it wrong. So we see your question, Roger Lancey. We will get to yours first when we get done with Eric's 5th headline from Marcus Freeman's press conference.
Well, the last headline is a good headline to be boring, and that's there was really not a whole lot to deal with in changing the depth chart. There weren't injury questions today. Usually I almost forced an injury question, but I think I'll force it Thursday and find out how Aiden Kiana is doing coming back from his off-season injury, because that was not supposed to be a season-ending injury for him. But really, I mean, this is as healthy as Notre Dame's been in terms of new injuries in quite some time. So they'll be as close to full strength as they can be without the people that have obviously been out, that were ruled out for the season earlier this year.
Yeah, the only sort of oddities from the game were Braden Lenzy not playing much on offense, and Marcus Freeman after the game chalked that up to Braden Lenzy being ill at the start of last week, and so that took him out of some of the practice time, and they liked what they could do with some taller wide receivers in the package. Now, it doesn't help when you have taller wide receivers when your quarterback's throwing it at their ankles, but Deion Colsey certainly took advantage of his opportunities in sort of replacing Braden Lenzy in the rotation, and Tobias Merriweather didn't make a catch, but was out there quite a bit as well. And then the other thing was Jarrett Patterson towards the end of the game. They replaced him with Andrew Kristofic. I think that was just a reward for, hey, you've done well. We know your foot is probably a little bit sore. Let's give you some time off here. Job well done. And it was just, I think, maybe the last series to run out the clock that Andrew Kristofic was in there playing a little bit of left guard. But yeah, it was a clean game from a health perspective, something that was certainly needed for Notre Dame when you're heading into a matchup against Clemson. All right, let's get to questions. We only have one so far queued up, so please send us questions while we're discussing Roger's question here. And if you don't send it right away, we will circle back to more questions later. So please feel free to send those in. But this question we have from Roger Lancey: what areas does the Notre Dame quarterback need to improve to give them a chance to beat Clemson? There was another screenshot of Tommy Rees shouting at Drew to do your job. That is not coaching.
Okay, so the reason Clemson is problematic for Notre Dame from a defensive standpoint is what their strengths are. They are an elite run defense. Notre Dame's faced 3 of them, and you guys will laugh. Marshall is 6th in the country in rush defense. However, they've kind of fallen apart on a lot of other areas, but they've done a good job of that against the teams they've played, including Notre Dame. Ohio State is 10th. Clemson is 7th. And Clemson is good enough in its front 7 that they can say, okay, we're going to bring a safety down into the box and force Drew Pine to beat us in the air. They also are capable of doing what some of the other teams have been doing lately to frustrate Drew Pine, and that's drop 8 into coverage and rush only 3. And then that's kind of where it becomes problematic that Drew Pine isn't a better than average runner, because somebody like Tyler Buckner or Ian Book could make you pay for that by just running the ball. And so Drew Pine doesn't have that capability. So what does he need to improve on? I would say, first of all, at least hit your open passes. there have been too many just kind of yippy, kind of throw it into the turf or overthrow a receiver, wide open receiver by many yards. If he just hits the receivers that are open, that's going to be a big improvement. We can't ask him to be something that he's not. So I think it's going to be a lot of mid-range and short passes. But I mean, if he can hit those, that's an improvement, and he can't make mistakes. Notre Dame cannot afford to lose the turnover battle against Clemson. This has to be a game where they win the turnover battle. But I mean, he's been at or below 50% for 3 straight weeks. And in today's football, that's not even close to where you need to be from a completion percentage standpoint.
Yeah. I think from the first thing, he can't put the ball in danger. And that the one time he did that against Syracuse, it was intercepted. He really forced a pass to Michael Mayer when Mayer had 3 linebackers sort of sitting in front of him on a crossing route. And then the safety that ended up intercepting the pass was deep behind Mayer, and Mayer tried to get a hand on it, which he did, and then that only redirected it towards the safety for the interception. So can't force things when they're not there. Throw the ball away sometimes. I think that he can do a better job of, like you said, hitting those guys, making reads quickly and delivering the ball quickly. I think sometimes, at least from my perspective, Drew Pine struggles a little bit when he's getting later on in his progression and he's not sure what to do. He's like, oh crap. And he starts looking around. Usually his eyes will come back to Michael Mayer. If Mayer's covered, maybe not figuring out what to do with it from there. And then I think at that point, he's like, well, I can't be in the pocket anymore. Let me move a little bit. I think sometimes he maybe loses his base. He doesn't have the best arm, so throwing on the run isn't necessarily a strength of his. So at least if he's trying to throw it deep. So I think he loses some of that accuracy and maybe doesn't have enough power to get it where he wants to sometimes. And that's sort of leading to some of those balls that were thrown into the turf and not quite getting to his targets against Syracuse. So I think there are a number of things that they could do there. Some of the things are he's just, once he makes his read, he's got to make the throw. I think there was a first down that I think people were pretty upset that we're running the ball so well. Why did we try to pass it there? And I think from my eyes, it looked like it was a read, an RPO read, or not an RPO, because I don't think he even faked a handoff, but he just read at the line, hey, these are free yards for Lorenzo Styles. I'm just going to take the ball and try to throw it. But I think a defensive end sort of got himself in the passing lane. And so then Drew hesitated. And then the play ended up, I don't think anything good ended up happening from it.
The football had turf toe.
So yeah, there are plenty of things that he can do to improve. I think that it was not a coincidence that last week when we were talking to Tommy Rees about Drew Pine focusing on Michael Mayer a little too much, that Drew Pine was sort of leaving the room. We were interviewing guys as Tommy was answering that question, and he says he raised his voice a little bit. Sometimes our eyes have to go somewhere else because he's maybe missing some guys that are open. I think there's maybe some checkdowns, especially when the defense is dropping 8. I'll be interested to see how much Clemson does that, because Syracuse had some success against Notre Dame. And I think that really jams things up for Drew Pine, because he's trying to find someone to go to. I don't know that he's confident enough in his legs to just go ahead and take off and run as much as Ian Book would. So I think that all those things are sort of adding up. As for the Tommy Rees shouting, do your job, I mean, I think it's important to remember there's an entire game of coaching that Tommy Rees is doing that they're not showing you. I mean, they may be showing Tommy Rees a lot, but they're only going to show you the stuff that's interesting to see on camera. So when you see him yelling at Drew, that's when they're going to show you. If he's just talking to him calmly, they're probably not going to show that as much. So I'm sure there are other things being communicated to Drew Pine, and it worked last time. So I think Drew Pine has said that he likes being coached hard, and so Tommy Rees is going to coach him that way. Just because Drew Pine didn't respond doesn't mean that Tommy Rees did something wrong. I think there are other things that I would probably nitpick than Tommy Rees yelling at a quarterback who's missing some open throws. All right, we have some more questions rolling in, Eric. This one is from Daniel McCarty. Good evening. On many passes, the running back is open on a check down on critical downs. Why doesn't Drew see them? Well,
I think there's the biggest reason is because he's looking for a security blanket, which Tyler just alluded to, Michael Mayer. And maybe he's just slow on his progressions to get to that check down. And I agree. I think there were 2 or 3 times where I noted in the Syracuse game where, boy, he had a big possible gain if he just checked it down rather than chucking it down the field. And again, some of it may be there's people in his passing lanes he can't see. Maybe that's why he can't get through his progressions as quickly. But you're absolutely right on the observation that there are running backs open, and they look like they could be, significant gains if he got the ball to them on the check down.
Yeah, I'm sure that came up in film review that, hey, listen, you got an easy guy here. I think he's just not getting to that part of his passing progression, and maybe those running backs, and Marcus Freeman alluded to this a little bit today, that sometimes like the running backs aren't even in pass protection, they maybe aren't doing the right thing in terms of giving Drew Pine the room or the throwing lane that's needed. And maybe sometimes the running backs aren't getting out into the routes soon enough for Drew Pine to do that, or maybe there's just not a trust built there. I'm not sure how comfortable Drew is with those shorter throws. Maybe that's something he doesn't like doing. And I think sometimes when you have edge rushers coming at you from the sides, sometimes your line of sight is maybe cut off a little bit from seeing those guys. And then it also maybe increases the chances of one of those guys batting the pass down. So I think those things may be going through Drew Pine's head, but he has to be able to make those, because those sort of like what I was talking about, the Lorenzo style throw earlier. Those are free yards that Notre Dame can take advantage of if he makes the right decision there. We have another Drew Pine suggestion / question from Scott Fegan. What about a rolling pocket that may give him a better look and see the field?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that crosses my mind when he's in the pocket and doesn't maneuver well there, or can't see over 6'8" Joe Alt and 6'5" Jarrett Patterson. Luckily, he's got only a 6'3" center. However, here's the downside of doing that too much. If you're going to roll him out to the right, then you've halved the field. They don't have to worry about what's going on the left, to his left, too much, unless it's a short, very short pass that goes the other way. He's not going to throw across the grain, or that's going to get picked off. So you're really taking a lot of receivers. You're taking a lot of field out of consideration. I mean, you do that sometimes, even for quarterbacks that don't have. It's not necessarily a height thing. Notre Dame did that with Deshaun Kaiser when he first was the starter, because they wanted to make things easier for him. So they just split the field in half and said, this is what you're worrying about on this play. This is what you're worrying about this play. Jarius Jackson, even late in his career, they basically have the field for him, just because it was easier for him to process that and get through the read. So there's advantages to that. But again, then you're limiting yourself. A couple other things. What do you do if you roll him left? He doesn't look like he throws very well.
Don't do it. Don't do it.
Right.
He doesn't roll left. I don't think he throws left particularly well either. I think
he does not throw left well. And the other thing was, we didn't get to see a lot in the practices, but one drill that I watched about every day, because Tyler forced me to write practice reports, there was one with the quarterbacks, and they would have a guy stand stationary. They were supposed to see how accurate they were in terms of hitting that receiver that wasn't moving. And they would have the quarterbacks do that from the pocket with no rush or whatever. And then they would have them do it on the move. And Drew Pine was not good on the move. Tyler Buckner nailed those throws. Drew Pine, nope, not even close. And really, Steve Angeli wasn't as good on the move either. I'd say he probably was second place out of those three. Mm-hmm. Angeli looked really good in a clean pocket. So those are some of the reasons that they have to kind of bounce around and weigh the pros versus the cons.
Yeah, I think you could do sort of move the pocket and then ask him to reset. But yeah, the throwing on the run is not something that I've seen a lot that I like from him out of that. And the one thing I do like is sort of the RPO action where usually it's like a tight end like Michael Mayer coming behind the line of scrimmage. And it's just an easy throw. Sometimes it could be Lorenzo Styles. And Pine will be rolling to his right to do that. And it's an easy throw. And so those are some things that they can do, but that's not really, I mean, that'll help the passing statistics and gives you some easy yards and get the ball in your hands of your playmakers. But I don't know that that's necessarily solving some of the issues that people want to be solved in terms of being able to push the ball downfield better. Maybe he can do that if they reset the pocket to the right, and that gives them a better chance to do that. I think what Notre Dame has to figure out, and these have to be conversations between Tommy Rees and Drew Pine, is Drew Pine literally not seeing these things, or is he not recognizing them? Because there is a difference. There's a difference between he's unable to see that receiver coming open because his vision is blocked, or is he just not? Is he not moving his head to look in that direction? Is he not recognizing where he should be looking at certain times to make those throws? So I think that Drew has to sort of be honest with Tommy and sort of communicating what part of the progression is sort of failing them to sort of address those issues. Another question here from Daniel McCarty. Any chance Chris Tyree makes an appearance in the slot?
Well, they've motioned him into the slot a couple times. Sometimes when they've had two running backs in the game, he's played a little bit of slot. Could he be there more? Possibly. I mean, he played there in high school before he became a running back. He's very comfortable with that. I think it fits his skill set. So I'm not against him being in the slot. Sure. I mean, I think that's something that could be on the table for Chris Tyree. As long as, Audric Estime is in the good, good hands team, and Logan Diggs is healthy. Earlier in the season, Logan wasn't healthy coming out of the gate this year. And now that they have three of them, I do think that they could do more things in a variety with Chris Tyree if they wanted to.
Yeah, I would say as long as Audric is in the penthouse and not the doghouse, that he can that opens the opportunities of what they can do with Chris Tyree. I think there are things that they can do certainly with sort of the jet sweep motions and things like that they have done with Chris Tyree. I'd like to see probably some more of that and less of him in the backfield as long as Logan Diggs and Audric Estime are playing so well. I'm not sure what routes Chris Tyree runs well from the slot. Like those just aren't things that we would have necessarily a good grasp of because we haven't seen of it. But you could just do a simple drag route and just let him cross the field. And if he gets matched up with a linebacker, catch the ball and run away from those guys, I think that would be something that could be intriguing. And if you keep him to the slot opposite of Michael Mayer, where there's certainly going to be a lot of attention, you would think there's probably some weakness in the defense for doing that. Now, again, you're talking about a small target for Drew Pine to hit, and when he's struggling with his accuracy is throwing the ball downfield to Chris Tyree.
Well, at least they're kind of on the same level, though.
Right, and Chris Tyree maybe can handle those throws that are low a little bit easier. He doesn't have to reach as far. But yeah, I think Tommy Rees is interested in getting Chris Tyree involved in different ways. So I would expect them to do some more of that. Sort of like going back to what we said, if Audric Estime and Logan Diggs are reliable. We have one more here that I feel like obligated to do. I don't want to be ignoring my father. But he says, "Hey, Tyler, is that a Slicer Football Hall of Fame plaque hanging on your wall?" And he is right. This my left is my Slicer Football Hall of Fame plaque. But I'd rather not spend too much time or attention on that because there's a much more impressive orange team coming to town this week than the LaPorte Slicers.
Right. And to clarify for people that don't know what a slicer is, it's the mascot of Tyler's high school football team, LaPorte High School in Indiana. Not a slicer as in what you shave cold cuts with if you go to Jimmy John's.
But that is where the name came from. There was a plant in LaPorte that they used to produce meat slicers. So that's where the slicers name came from. So we certainly have a unique name, and that's also where the orange came from. That's why we got so much orange around here.
Well, both my kids were born in LaPorte, so I guess they're slicers at heart.
That's right. All right, those are all the questions we have, Eric. Let's get back to some of our script here.
Okay, well, let's look at kind of the bottom line from the Syracuse game. So it was 41-24. Notre Dame pulled away in the fourth quarter, outscoring the Orange 17-7. Here's some significant stats. For the first time, with Marcus Freeman being the head coach, Notre Dame won the turnover battle. It was 2-1. Interceptions by Brandon Joseph and Maris Leofau. A third interception by Joseph, which would have been his second, was wiped out by an offsides penalty. Notre Dame won the total yardage battle 362-286. Where they really had the command was in the rushing game, 246-61. The 61 rushing yards are the fewest Notre Dame has allowed this season. As far as the 246 rushing yards, that came on a season-high 56 carries. I mentioned Notre Dame starting out in the I formation with 2 backs and 2 tight ends. Audric Estime bouncing back from his fumbleitis. There's a few other things here. Deion Colzie was 3 catches for 44 yards, including a huge third down late in the game when Notre Dame was clinging to a 24-17 lead that kept a scoring drive going. Notre Dame was 6 of 15 on third down, including 3 of 9 in the second half. We mentioned Drew Pine's stats. 9 of 19 for 116 yards, 1 interception, and 1 touchdown. In the second half, he had how many completions, Tyler?
I do know this. It's 1.
1 completion in the second half.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. And it was a big one. It was an 11.
It was to Colzie on that third down that I mentioned.
Right, but he was 1 of 5. So I mean, it's a bad sign that he only completed 1. But it's a good sign that Notre Dame only needed him to throw 5. So you'd like that percentage to be up better, but I think that's a pretty good indication of where Notre Dame's pass offense is right now.
Well, if Notre Dame only throws the ball 5 times against Clemson in the second half, that's not going to be a good sign, because I think Notre Dame's rushing offense against Clemson's rushing defense is going to be a really neat matchup. And the last time the two teams played, Notre Dame crushed Clemson in the running game. But I don't think that's happening this Saturday. Ian Book was able to make Clemson pay enough with his arm, and he had a really good game with his legs too. A couple more stats. Isaiah Foskey ended up with some amended stats. They added a half sack to his total, so he ended up with 4 tackles, 2.5 tackles for loss, 1.5 sacks. So he's at, and a quarterback hurry. So he's at 23 sacks right now for his career. He's in second place by himself. He untied Corey Minor with that extra half a sack. The school record is 24.5, held by Justin Tuck. As far as the season, he's got 7.5, which is tied for second most in the nation. He's a half sack out of the lead. Jose Ramirez of Eastern Michigan has 8 to lead the country. We mentioned Jordan Botello's 2 sacks. I got to mention Mitchell Evans. He converted a third down conversion, a fourth down conversion. So far he has 4 conversions and 4 carries. That would be 2 third downs, a fourth down, and a touchdown. You know, Tyler, with that, what I think is interesting is they could expand that package. They could have him, now that teams have seen it on film, he could throw out of that. He's a high school quarterback at Wadsworth, Ohio High School. And so I think it would be interesting, you know, for them to line up like that and then him, you know, just kind of take a couple steps back and fire a fade to Michael Mayer or Tobias Merriweather or Deion Colzie.
Yeah, I'd prefer to see that on maybe like a 1st and goal play rather than like on a 3rd and 1,
Right.
because just get the yard because it works.
Right.
But yeah, no, there's certainly other things that they could do out of that. I don't know if they would have him hand off, but he's played quarterback before, so he should be able to handle some of the
Every
responsibilities.
down. I mean, in high school, he
So
wasn't a tight end.
right, so it's not like it's something that's completely new to him. So yeah, there are wrinkles that I'm sure are in there and will be pulled out when necessary. Though I'm sure if they don't work, Tommy Reese will get some crap for it. But
Somebody will yell at him on the phone.
yeah, I think a couple of things that I don't think you mentioned. There were seven defensive series for Notre Dame that were actual series, not just like end of halves, that ended in 3 plays or less, with 5 3-and-outs, and then the 2 interceptions came within the first 3 plays of drive. So that came on 15 possessions for Syracuse. So that's a pretty good stat for Notre Dame to be able to. And honestly, the way Notre Dame's punt block team is going, is getting the punt team on the field is good in more ways than one for what Notre Dame's defense can bring from that. And the only 7 rushing yards for the 2 Syracuse quarterbacks combined, Garrett Schrader and Carlos Del Rio Wilson. I think that was incredibly important. That was something that I was a bit concerned about going into the game for Notre Dame.
Right. Schrader was the leading rusher in the Clemson game.
It seemed likely that Garrett Schrader was limited, and that led to him being pulled, and that probably made Notre Dame's job a little bit easier. It seemed like there were probably some more running opportunities where he was just throwing it rather than sort of maybe truly finishing out the RPO and looking at himself as a running option. So Notre Dame was fortunate in that aspect. Del Rio Wilson was a pretty good athlete too, so he took off and run a couple times, but they were able to sack him a few times as well, which kept his rushing yards low. So those were 2 very important statistics from Notre Dame's defense against Syracuse.
Yeah, the Schrader thing, I didn't see it live, but I saw it on a replay after the fact. When he got sacked in the first half, he got up and it was like he was punch drunk. I mean, he was staggering and stumbling and looked disoriented. So yeah, I think pulling him was the right thing to do.
Yeah, Dino Babers didn't explain what was going on, and he seemed to downplay that.
Say it wasn't a head injury.
Yeah, it wasn't a head injury. I think he probably was alerted of that clip that was going out there. It did look like the quarterback also maybe stepped on a lineman's foot that maybe led to that, but it still looked bad. And he certainly was dealing with something. It was probably, I guess I probably shouldn't say probably. I don't really know. But Dino Babers said something that he felt like he wasn't able to protect himself with what he was dealing with, and that you would think like being able to escape pressure had a lot to do with that. So I think I think Notre Dame was fortunate in that, and but certainly they still had to go out there and play. Syracuse could have still taken advantage of it and did on its second drive after it went right down the field. So Notre Dame adjusted and was able to play better defense against Garrett Schrader and Arande Gadsden the second and the rest of the Syracuse weapons.
Well, let's move to our In the Trenches segment where we honor / talk about / dissect offensive line play. Why? Because offensive line play is a thing with the Notre Dame fan base. There's no fan base that knows and scrutinizes offensive line play more than the Notre Dame fan base. So the fact that an offensive lineman got the player of the week for offense is a good sign. And it would have been hard not to give it to one of them. I think I agree with Marcus. You could have probably given it to any of the 5 of them, the way that Notre Dame just absolutely blew out Syracuse's undersized defensive front.
Yeah, I think Zeke Correll would maybe been the one person that I wouldn't have necessarily given it to, but I wouldn't have probably said any complaints. But I don't think he played particularly well. I think, but the offensive line as a whole played pretty well. I think Blake Fisher could have been a little bit sharper in some of his pass protection, but the unit as a group played extremely well. It's another good game for that offensive line unit, and we're doing more honoring than criticizing in this segment as of late because the offensive line is playing well. Certainly it was helped by Syracuse dropping 8 several times to make it easier to protect Drew Pine. But Syracuse's defense threw a number of different looks at Notre Dame to try to bring up some confusion and cause some issues in pass protection, and Notre Dame had answers for it. The one sack that Drew Pine took was totally on him. He took forever and never got rid of the ball, and that sort of led to the sack. So I think that was a pretty good effort from Notre Dame's offensive line, and it will be tested at a much higher level this weekend against Clemson with that defensive front, because they have talent at every position and more than one player at some of those positions as well. So that is going to be, if I could only watch one thing on Saturday, I would just watch Notre Dame's offensive line versus Clemson's defensive line, because that is probably going to have a big say in how this game goes for either team.
Well, how do you think Notre Dame's going to fare? You giggled when I said Marshall was 6th in rush defense, so we'll take them out of the mix and just talk about Ohio State, who's held up as the number 10 rush defense, and they're actually very good in a bunch of categories. Ohio State is, they are 6th in total defense and 10th in scoring defense, 4th and 3rd down defense. So they've held up ever since they've played Notre Dame.
I do think that's a little bit aided by the lack of Big Ten offense that they faced. If you look at some of those defensive standings, there's a lot of Big Ten teams towards the top there, because I don't think there's a lot of good offense being played in that conference. But Ohio State's defense does have talent, and it is the most comparable defensive front that Notre Dame will have played compared to Clemson. So I think I would probably give the nod to Clemson in terms of its talent. Clemson hasn't had all of its guys sort of available and healthy and playing together a lot this season. And so this week against Notre Dame, unfortunately from Notre Dame's perspective, should be one of those times. So Notre Dame is going to be asked to do a lot in terms of creating movement, creating protection. I think certainly Drew Pine making some completions to take some of the pressure off of Notre Dame's front in having to sort of only gain yards consistently in the running game would be a big help. But Notre Dame's going to have a lot to do in terms of taking care of this defensive front from Clemson.
Right. The thing I'll also point out is the last time these two teams played in Notre Dame Stadium, Notre Dame outrushed Clemson 209-34, which was just a stunning thing. Now, Clemson wasn't a great rushing team that year. Travis Etienne was still on the team, but they were not the typical Clemson rushing team. This is a better rushing team with sophomore Will Shipley, who, people that follow recruiting closely will remember him as the back that kind of got away a couple of recruiting cycles ago. Tyler, do we want to circle back to questions or move ahead here?
Let's move ahead.
Okay. So was there anybody that really surprised you in the game as from a Notre Dame standpoint?
Yeah, there were two guys, and I think we've touched a little bit on both of them, and one on each side of the ball. Deion Colsey at wide receiver made his first 3 catches of the season. One of those was a big 3rd down conversion, which thankfully for his sake, he didn't drop, even though he maybe started to drop it, but he did hold on to it. That was at a big moment for Notre Dame in extending its lead later that drive after that 3rd down conversion. Like we mentioned earlier, that was the one pass Drew Pine completed in the second half. So nice to see him out there. I think we've seen less of him in large part due to some of the knee issues that he's been dealing with. I think the way Marcus Freeman maybe described his PCL injury made it seem like that wasn't going to limit him very much, but I think it did limit him more than I think was given credit for initially. And so to see him healthy and out there and on the same page with Drew Pine is a big thing for Notre Dame, because he's another big target. He can be a possession receiver. I don't know that he can stretch the field in the same ways that Tobias Merriweather may be able to do, but he gives another look to the offense that certainly any help it can get at the wide receiver position is welcome, because that group hasn't produced a lot this season. And the guy on defense is Jordan Botelho, the 2 sacks in the second half. I did not see that coming. That would be a pleasant addition. When Notre Dame could get more and more guys to throw at the opposing quarterback and give the opposing offensive line more problems, that's a good thing to have. So if they can keep him productive and staying on task and doing what's asked of him, that could be an intriguing weapon for Notre Dame's defense moving forward.
In terms of questions answered, I think the defense is starting to answer some things affirmatively. And I think one of the reasons is, I read Kyle Kelly's snap count story every week, and Isaiah Foskey is playing a higher percentage of snaps. It seemed like earlier in the season, he was about 50%. I mean, he was really splitting that. And I think they've cranked up his snaps, and he's been really productive. He's responded well to it. And I think they have to. I think the rotation is really good, but people have pointed this out, that there were times in very critical drives, Isaiah Foskey was on the sideline, and not because of injury.
Yeah, I had to fill out my Rotary Lombardi Award.
Me too.
Semifinalist, finalist, whatever it is.
Yeah.
There were 12 of them. And I went back and forth a little bit on whether or not I should include Isaiah Foskey. I think he's certainly talented enough. And he has made plays, like you mentioned. He's up towards the top in the country in terms of sacks now, and that has been a large part of the play he's had in the last 2 weeks. I did include him on the list, but 2 weeks ago I probably wouldn't have. So I think that sort of speaks to the up and down play that he's had this season, and he certainly impacts what the defense could do. Did you include him on your list?
I did. I included him and Michael Mayer. Lombardi encompasses so many people, so it's a hard
it took me a lot
award
of time
to win, because it's tight ends. Yeah, it's an offensive lineman and defensive lineman and some linebackers, and so there are some good ones. And I put down a lot of people that I had seen, and some people that I had only seen on television, and tried to look at the stats. But you can't argue Michael Mayer being the best tight end, and then Isaiah Foskey statistically is up there. Now he needs to keep coming, or he won't be on the finalist list, but I did include him on that. Boy, that was a painstaking, time-consuming task. I'm not nearly on as many of those as I used to be, because when we switched emails, all those people lost my email. Now they've been finding me, the Bolitnikoff and the Groza and stuff. But I think I was on every one of those, plus the AP poll. I'm glad I've got a reprieve from that. I just hope people realize the person that replaced me is a different person.
I think they've realized, because he has taken plenty of heat, and Marcus Freeman has brought it up a couple of times after press conferences the last couple of weeks, asking Mike Berardino of the South Bend Tribune where he has Tennessee ranked. And the Tennessee fans have been making it well known that they have issues with him ranking Alabama above Tennessee, which I can understand people taking issue with that. I would probably be giving Eric a hard time if he were doing the same thing.
I would give me a hard time if I were doing the same thing. I teased Mike a little bit today, because John Bryce asked him if Tennessee lost to Georgia, would he drop Tennessee completely out? And I said, or move them to number 1.
That's funny. Yeah, that's AP poll voting is, you can speak to it. It's a task. You have to spend time doing it, and you don't get to see all the teams play every week. And so it takes a lot of time and effort to do that. So I can understand why some mistakes are made, but Mike seems pretty strong and firm in his stance on where he's ranking Tennessee as of late.
Well, I don't understand it, but I'll leave that alone. I know that people disputed some of the reasons, though, that they came up with disputing. There was one guy that was upset that I didn't have Nebraska in the top 25 once. And his argument for it was that if I didn't, then the coach wouldn't get a bonus, and it would somehow hurt their recruiting. So that I was supposed to be aware of all these things and make my decision based on these strange criteria for Nebraska. It wasn't like he was arguing that they deserved to be in there. So, but yeah, you would hear from it. You heard from people a lot more when the AP poll was part of the BCS formula.
Right.
Then people took it a lot more seriously. Now they just think you're an idiot and they just leave you alone.
Yeah, well, they're not leaving Mike alone, but but I mean, after that'll change here once the college football playoff rankings. They'll have other places to take their attention off of, and obviously, it doesn't impact where those guys can end up in terms of the college football playoff. So it's not as the stakes aren't as high. We have a couple more questions here. I thought we could throw in here towards the end. First one is from Scott Fegan. Okay, we are about 6 weeks out, I think, for early signing day. That is a really strong class minus the quarterback. That said, is MD looking, I think maybe ND is probably what he meant there, looking at a transfer after the season. Any other missing pieces, defensive line, ?
Yeah, they could. Let's go to the defensive line. Yes, if there was a veteran edge pass rusher, I think they could look at somebody like that and bring them in to compete. As far as the quarterback, early on when people were asking me this, like the first couple weeks of the season, I wanted to kind of see how things played out. As I look at it now, I do think if they bring in a transfer quarterback, there's a good chance they'll lose a quarterback off their roster that they already have. But I think they need to take that risk. I think Tyler Buchner just hasn't played enough football. I think he could still be an outstanding quarterback, but I think you need to bring somebody in that's capable of starting, not a depth quarterback, but that's capable to compete to be the starting quarterback to go against Tyler Buchner. And certainly Drew Pine would have a chance. But there are quarterbacks that make huge leaps from one year to the next, and Garrett Schrader is one of them. But I don't see Drew Pine having that kind of ceiling, and so I think you have to risk what Drew Pine's going to do if you bring that person in. But I think at this point you've got to start doing your due diligence and be ready to offer some guys in December, because I think you need to bring that person in spring football. I think if you bring them in June to play quarterback, that's not going to do you what you need to have done.
Yeah, there's still not a great plan, in my opinion, for 2023 quarterbacks, and Kyle Kelly will likely have more on that later this week on the Insider Lounge and InsideNDSports.com in terms of what Notre Dame's efforts are there. And regardless, I don't think that 2023 quarterback would be coming in and trying to start next season. So I don't know that would be a huge impact. So
I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing at some of the things that are coming in the question.
No, I figured that was the case. But in terms of the defensive ends, I think Notre Dame has to create opportunities for itself in terms of pursuing transfers. That's something that I had heard that Notre Dame is interested in looking at more Vipers in the 2023 class, but hasn't really found a match there. And it really needs someone to be like a high caliber like Keon Keeley, because that person could be playing next season. So I think that will be somewhere Notre Dame looks in the transfer portal. Unless maybe like I guess Justin Ademilola could stay a year, right? I think he has a redshirt year. I think he would be able to stay one more year.
I think he could do a COVID year. I'm not convinced that he would.
No, I'm not. I don't know that he would either, but maybe that's an option if Notre Dame feels like it can't find what it needs in the transfer portal. But obviously Justin Ademilola has to do what he feels is best for himself, because he's already been. This will be his 5th season. That would be his sixth season of college football, and it would not be with his twin brother. So maybe that would be a cool opportunity to not play with Jason, because they're probably not going to be playing together wherever either of them ends up on a pro team next season. All right, another one from Bob Alvey. Take away the 2-yard touchdown after the punt block, and Notre Dame's offense scored 27 points. How can we beat Clemson without a passing game? Obviously, Steve Angeli is not the answer, or we could have seen more last week.
Yeah, I would agree with everything Bob said. I think that's more of a rhetorical question than
right.
than an actual question. I think you're spot on, Bob. They cannot beat Clemson without an adequate passing game. Drew Pine doesn't have to be Joe Montana in the game, but he needs to at least be Ian Bookish in the game where he can, function as a passer. Clemson's going to put the game in his hands, and Notre Dame to a certain extent is going to be able to offset with its running game. But boy, that running game's a lot better when you also have to defend the pass.
Yeah, I would say it's not impossible for Notre Dame to beat Clemson without a passing game, but that would take a gargantuan effort from Notre Dame's running game and arguably the best offensive line and running back performance of any team this season for Notre Dame to be able to do that if Drew Pine is only going to complete something like 9 passes. So the pressure is going to be on him to come up with plays in the passing game this week. And
it's not a game that's going to be played in monsoon or anything like that. I don't think we're supposed to have rain. And I think the high is supposed to be 70 or 71 on Saturday night and low of 60. So it's going to be Clemson weather.
Yeah, that's not what Notre Dame was hoping for when it put Clemson on the schedule for November. I imagine it would have liked some colder conditions. Although I don't think it was bad conditions the last time Notre Dame played Clemson either, which obviously DJ Uyunglele wasn't limited in the passing game for Clemson.
It was not. That game is still so surreal. 11,000 people in the stands because of COVID, and it was just. And then the fans storming the field, and this is pre-vaccine, but they had all been tested. So, I mean, they caught some criticism for it, but it was what a surreal game. It was just amazing. One of the coolest games that I've attended in all my years.
Well, sadly, I wasn't there, but I do have very vivid memories of watching it from home.
And the reason being, they severely limited the press box. I think there were 9 of us in the press box, or some very low number like that.
Yeah, but I thought it was really cool to see hear Marcus Freeman's memories of the game. He watched most of the game and wanted to see how Mike Mickens was doing, someone he had coached with and has a good relationship with, and it wasn't going well for him and Notre Dame's cornerbacks, and he sort of made a remark to that. But he wasn't just BSing, because he was telling us specific moments of the game how he wasn't necessarily always had the right person's name or whatever, but he thought that he knew that a specialist made a big hit, and it was Jay Bramblett and not Jonathan Dorr that made a big hit on special teams. But
he remembered Avery Davis's big catch.
He remembered Avery Davis's big catch. Remembered them giving fits to DJ Uyunglele at the end of the second overtime. So that was kind of cool, and sort of speaks to sort of how big that moment was for even people that weren't necessarily tied to Notre Dame or Clemson that Saturday a couple years ago. All right. Speaking of Clemson, Eric, can you give us a quick look ahead? I know we've touched on them a little bit already, but anything else you want to add about Clemson before we wrap up the show?
Well, I mean, pretty decent offense, pretty balanced offense. Will Shipley has done a really good job of running the ball for them. They're 50th in total offense, to give you an idea where Notre Dame is. They're 77th. Pass efficiency, they're better than Notre Dame. Sacks allowed, they're about the same. They're a better third down team, red zone team. But there was a big gap between those two teams offensively. There isn't as much. And then when you look at defensively, Notre Dame is really surging. Clemson is better in most categories there. Notre Dame has more sacks. Clemson has more tackles for loss. Notre Dame is actually a better third down defense. If Notre Dame can force some turnovers, and they did in that double overtime game. Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah had an epic game in the double overtime win. Notre Dame could take this game into the fourth quarter. I think Clemson deserves to be favored, but these teams statistically are a lot closer than they were just a few weeks ago. And Clemson hasn't played a killer schedule at this point. Their wins, they had the win over Georgia Tech to start the season, Furman, Louisiana Tech. Then they had the double overtime win over Wake Forest, beat NC State by 10. Boston College is awful. They beat them by 4 touchdowns, beat Florida State by 6 in a game that they really had control of. Florida State had a late touchdown there. And then the Syracuse comeback against Syracuse. You could argue that Notre Dame and maybe Wake Forest are the best 2 teams they will have played this year, since Notre Dame, beat Syracuse by 17.
All right. Well, that's all we have for you guys tonight. I'm curious if you can comment either now or after we end. We seem to get more viewers towards the latter half of our show. So would people be interested in us starting at maybe like 7:30 on future Mondays? I'm curious for some feedback from that point of view, because we want to get to in front of as many of you as possible. But we appreciate everyone who tuned in live or is watching this on replay. Please subscribe to receive reminders for future live shows, and throw us, like I mentioned earlier, throw us a like and give us a comment to tell us what you think of the show, what we can do in terms of being available at better times. And I appreciate this most recent comment from We Are Not Marshall. He's shooting their shot. ND is lurking and will slay the dragon this weekend against Clemson. So we'll see if We Are Not Marshall is correct about that. We Are Not Marshall sounds like it's trolling Notre Dame, but also has a lot of confidence in Notre Dame at the same time. So I appreciate that comment. Next on the YouTube agenda for us will be our Friday Place Your Bets for the Clemson game. On Tuesday, we will have our Inside ND Sports podcast for anyone who likes to listen to us. And there is always written content on InsideNDSports.com and plenty of discussion happening on the Insider Lounge. Happy Halloween.